any comments or questions via the chat function for our team members to answer at the appropriate time. This meeting is being videotaped, as well as presentations made tonight will be uploaded to the city's website created for this project. That website is www.cityoftulsa.org/1921graves. Again, www.cityoftulsa.org/1921graves. At this time, we will have our invocation and ask everyone to join us in a moment of silence. Thank you so very much. Nick?
Thank you, Ms. Alford.
You're very welcome.
I believe we're going to have a quick, some comments from Dr. Scott Ellsworth on our process that got here. Dr. Ellsworth, can I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with you all. I wish I was in Tulsa, and I wish we were all together, but we have what we have. You have a lot to do tonight. I'm going to speak very briefly. Obviously, we did not get the results that we were hoping for in July at the Sexton site at Oaklawn Cemetery. Despite the fact that there was a very rich oral tradition handed down sexton to sexton, that massacre victims were buried in that area. This was also a tradition that also linked up with Darren Cravens, what Darren Cravens told Reverend Turner and Christie about massacre victims being buried there. There were the crepe myrtles that were buried by a sexton in the 1990s as a memorial. And most importantly, we had ground penetrating radar data that really sure seemed to indicate that we had a mass grave there, but we did not. Nonetheless, the Physical Investigation Committee, we are dedicated to moving ahead and moving ahead with all deliberate speed. We're going to present to you a proposal for next steps that we would like to have happen this fall. And so we are moving ahead. But before we do that, I just want to touch on a couple things very briefly. And specifically, you're going to hear a lot about Oaklawn, and I want to talk briefly about Oaklawn itself. There are a number of locations in town over the years that have been discussed as potential burial places for massacre victims. You know, some are very unlikely, others are possible, others are very difficult to get at for a variety of reasons. But Oaklawn is almost unique in that it is the one site in town that I can say with a 100% confidence that we know that African-American massacre victims were buried in Oaklawn Cemetery. We know it by virtue of the fact of the two headstones from the massacre for Reuben Everett and Eddie Lockhart. But we also know it because in 1998, Dick Warner of the Tulsa Historical Society had the good idea of going to white-owned funeral homes on the city's south side. And in one of those funeral homes, in a back room, you know, behind a bunch of boxes, he found ledgers that the funeral home had kept 75 years earlier that proved that that particular funeral home had billed the city of Tulsa for the burial of 18 unidentified and identified African-American riot victims that they had buried at Oaklawn Cemetery. We know the names of 13 of these individuals. We know a bit about some of them. Joe Miller was a chauffeur. He lived with his wife, Allie, up on Standpipe Hill. Curly Walker was about 30 years old. He was a hod carrier. That's somebody who would carry bricks and other construction materials. He lived with his wife, Myrtle. They roomed at 307.5 North Elgin. John Wheeler was 63 years old. He was a bank porter right downtown at First National Bank, which, as we all know, is still there today. He lived at 405 North Elgin. We also have 5 unidentified African-American riot victims. We know very little about them. These ledger pages would say name of deceased, unidentified Negro, date of death, June 1st, 1921, place of death, Tulsa, date of funeral, which really meant date of internment, June 2nd, no physician, county attorney name. Cause of death, gunshot wounds, riot. Occupation unknown. Sometimes they'd write an estimated age, sometimes they would not. But, you know, we know that these people are buried in Oaklawn, but we don't know where. And the problem is, in these funeral home ledgers, they would say buried in Oaklawn grave number 5 or Oaklawn grave number 12. Well, that wasn't the numbering system that Oaklawn Cemetery used in 1921. And the original maps for the cemetery, the original logbooks, that list of where people were buried, those have all disappeared, which is, of course, a story we know all too well when it comes to data about the race massacre. Nonetheless, we had a great amount of progress this year when Betsy Warner, who was Dick's daughter, really took it upon herself to really study Oaklawn Cemetery. She probably walked the cemetery 20 times, went through all of the available records, went through lists and maps that we had made 20 years ago. And what she figured out is that in the African-American part of the Potter's Field or Paupers area, the sextons in the 19-teens and 20s would bury by year. So there was a 1918 row and a 1919 row, a 1921 row, 1924 row, and so on. There wouldn't be a lot of burials per year, but they were there. And as it turned out, the two, existent African-American Riot headstones for Reuben Everett and Eddie Lockhart were right in that 1921 row. And Lockhart's name showed up on that funeral home registry from 1921 with all these riot victims. So we had a good sense that this was a good potential area where what we called the original 18, these 18 African-American massacre victims that we got through the funeral home records were buried. This has been, more evidence has come in the terms of ground penetrating radar and gradiometer surveys that were done by Scott Hammerstedt and Amanda last fall. So this shows anomalies that are there. So we're going to talk, Scott's going to talk more about that area. But there's also a possibility that these anomalies might represent another set of burials. In 1998, we got a call from a woman by the name of Virginia Stiles, and her grandfather was in the trash hauling business. In 1921, there weren't garbage trucks or a city trash service. People either burned their trash or hire contractors to haul it away. Her grandfather had a trash hauling service, and he told her, what she reported to us, that after the riot, a deputy sheriff had forced him, presumably at gunpoint, to haul the bodies, to carry the bodies of 6 Black riot victims and take them and put them in a hole in a low part of Oaklawn Cemetery. This area, where this original 18 area, is also a low part. So we don't know that, but the chances are quite strong that we may find massacre victims there. Now, there's another site, and you all have heard of it before. This is the Clyde Eddy site. I won't go into it in detail, but in 1999, we were approached by Mr. Eddy, who was 10 years old at the time of the massacre. Days after, he lived nearby to Oaklawn. A couple days after the massacre, he was cutting through the cemetery, which he often did, came upon a group of white workmen. There was a big trench or hole there. There were also some large wooden crates, the size that like a piano might be kept in. He lifted the lid on one, looked in, and he said he saw the bodies of 3 dead African-American men. He walked over to a second one, lifted the lid, and looked in again, saw 3 or 4 more bodies. At this point, the workmen saw him, yelled, get away from there. Mr. Eddy then just walked to the other side of the fence, the iron fence there on 11th Street. It was 10th Street then. Stood there for a while, watched them as they buried these bodies, and went on. Well, he remembered where that location was, and in 1999, he called us, told us where the location was, pointed to the area. We did ground penetrating radar back then. It showed an anomaly then, and then this was redone recently in 2019 and 2020, which once again, showed that there was an anomaly there. So these are the 2 areas in Oaklawn we're focused on very much tonight. finally, just one other last point. The massacre victims that were buried, the African-American massacre victims that were buried at Oaklawn, were done so by the white authorities while their families and loved ones were all being held against their will under armed guard in internment camps around the city for 3 days. The family members were not allowed to say any goodbyes. There were no prayers that were said over these people. They were literally thrown away. Well, we can't bring those goodbyes back. That's too late for that. But I do think that we need to push on, and if we are fortunate enough to find their remains, we can then once again rebury them with the dignity which they deserve. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. We appreciate your hard work and these efforts. Again, next we'll have Dr. Carrie Stackelbeck and Dr. Phoebe Stubblefield.
Thank you, Ms. Brenda. Here, if I will be able to, so Nick, am I going to be able to share my presentation?
You will, yep. I'm going to make you a presenter right now.
Okay.
You should be good.
All right. Here. Just a second. Let me see if I can minimize some of this stuff so that I can actually expand the presentation. All right, there we go. Okay, well, thank you for having us. I look forward to having the opportunity to present some of the results from our July 2020 investigations. Scott spoke about some of those results already, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of those excavation results. Let's see here. Are you all able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
Not really sure why it's not letting me advance, though, unfortunately. Okay, here we go. So Scott presented the historical background. And with regard to the overview of the results, as Scott mentioned, we did not, unfortunately, locate a mass grave or human remains in the area of the geophysical anomaly at the north end of the Sexton area. This was the location that we had originally proposed to the Public Oversight Committee in the city back in March with our proposal to do a limited test excavation in order to confirm or deny the presence of a mass grave within that geophysical anomaly that had been detected. Rather, what we ended up uncovering in that location was secondarily deposited historic and modern artifacts, as well as evidence of road and construction debris in that location. And you'll see kind of the series of those overlapping depositional sequences in that uppermost slide there, side of your screen, very tightly compacted. But having identified relatively early on in the process the fact that we were not in the location of a mass grave within what we ultimately ended up calling Block A, we coordinated with the city and members of the Public Oversight Committee to push ahead. Given some of that information that Scott presented so eloquently, is that we had abundant reason to have a high level of confidence in the Sexton area with regard to the potential presence of a mass grave in this location. So we determined to go on ahead and expand our excavation area to further test that, that portion of the cemetery to see if we might be able to identified the presence of a mass burial through more standard archaeological excavation techniques as opposed to just simply relying on the geophysical work. So we expanded that area to the south and cut a trench, which we referred to as Block B, to the south of Block A. In addition to the heavy machinery work that we conducted, we also brought in a mechanical coring to conduct deep samplings with a smaller diameter coring rig for the area to the east and south of Trench A to get, it's a bit of a quicker method to try to assess what the soils look like in that area and whether it was consistent or different than what we were seeing in the adjacent trench excavations. As a result of this, unfortunately, we did not identify a mass grave or human remains in any of these other excavation areas that we exposed. This presents, just kind of gives you an aerial overview of the cemetery, and thank you, Amanda Rainier, for doing an excellent job on some of these slides. I really appreciated your help with this. So you'll see the trench, you'll see the excavation area that we did this summer. So Trench A, Trench B, and then we expanded off to the east of the southern end of Trench B, and we call this Trench C. So you can see how that area, where that area is located in relation to the overall Sexton area. These blocks represent the geophysical survey areas, the grids that were where the geophysical survey data were obtained. On the right-hand side, you will see some of those geophysical survey results. So you can see how the Trench A was anomaly. That was so apparent, and that anomaly was spot on in terms of picking up an anomaly. It just was not the one that we were looking for, unfortunately. So all of that debris, all of that, those artifacts and those other materials that had been brought in and dumped in this location secondarily from other locations and became heavily compacted over time is what gave off this strong signature right here that's observed. Then, if you see, we move further to the south, and then this is an area that I'll be talking about in the next couple of slides. Just to show some of the examples of some of the artifacts from Trench A.